All right, welcome to my narrated presentation. So today we're going to talk about the history and ethics behind animal domestication.
I am a wolf.
Some of the Pleistocene epoch and half the Holocene epoch later.
Now I'm a dog.
All right, so let's get started with some objectives. So the first objective that I have set is that students will be able to understand the history, the practices, and the relevance of animal domestication. The second objective that I have is that students will understand the ethicality of domestication of varying animal species. All right, so let's start with a simple definition. So animal domestication can be defined as the process of creating a mutual relationship between animals and the humans who have influence on their care and their reproduction. All right, so let's start from the beginning. So it all started during the Pleistocene epoch, which lasted for about 2,500,000 years. And throughout this period of global history, there was many different periods of glaciation. So towards the end of the Pleistocene epoch, the planet began to warm and we entered into the Holocene epoch, which is actually the current epoch that we currently live in. So throughout the Holocene epoch, it gave way for better climates, which also gave way for more advanced plant and animal domestication. So this was also the beginning of the Neolithic transition, also known as the first major agricultural revolution. So during this time of human history, early humans were able to begin their domestication process with the early versions of the wild dog. And then this began to proceed throughout all of the Neolithic transition and throughout all of modern human history as well. So the first person to actually study domestication was Charles Darwin. So he first noticed the differences in traits between domesticated animals and their wild ancestors. So he was curious about the differences between the conscious, selectively bred animals that humans had bred themselves and the unconscious, natural selection of animals in the wild. And his discoveries were actually quite profound because it was later to be discovered that there was an actual genetic difference between the domesticated animals and their wild ancestors. So this was the first time in human history where the process of domestication was first begun to be understood. All right, so let's talk about the actual process of domestication. So there's thought to be three main pathways that different animals have become domesticated. The first is to an adaptation to a human niche. So that could be such as dogs, which are man's best friend, or cats, or horses, and many different birds as well, such as peregrine falcons and messenger penguins, messenger pigeons, and even animals like pigs who help humans find truffles, and any other animals that have a specific working job. Another type of domestication is the prey animals, and those are animals that are bred specifically for human consumption, such as cattle, pigs, sheep, many different types of birds, etc. And the last type of animals that were domesticated were non-prey animals. And this includes oryx, camels, llamas, mules, pretty much any animal whose only purpose is working. It's different from the first category because it doesn't really serve humans. It's just sort of existing under human control. So there are actually many different character traits of a species that would create a more ideal situation for them to be domesticated. So the first one is the social structure. So the size and organization of their social structure does play a big part in the domestication process. So does the mating and the availability of the degree of the selectivity in their choice of mates. So if an animal is less selective with their mates, they're typically more prone to domestication, whereas other animals, such as pandas, who are very selective with their mates, are typically very difficult for humans to domesticate. Another characteristic is the ease and speed in which parents bond with their young, and the maturity and the mobility of their young at birth. So animals that are essentially helpless when they're first born are typically more difficult to domesticate than animals that could have primal instincts upon birth. Another one would be the flexibility or the degree in the diet and the habitat of tolerance. So if an animal has a pretty wide flexibility with its diet and with the habitat it lives in, it's typically a lot easier to domesticate. And finally, the last one is the responses to humans in new environments. and their flight or fight reactions to humans and all of the different external stimuli that they have in their daily lives. So if an animal is a lot more prone to human interaction, then it's typically a much easier animal to domesticate. All right, so let's talk about the real question here. All right, so getting into the ethicality of the issue. So obviously there's a really big difference between taming and domesticating. So let's start with the definition. So taming can be defined as the conditioned behavioral modification of a wild-born animal when its natural avoidance of humans is reduced and it accepts the presence of humans in its life. So there's obviously a lot to be said about the difference between domestication and taming of animals. You obviously cannot look at a picture of a tamed lion or a performing elephant and assume that they have been fully domesticated. So there are actually many different animals who are considered to be working animals or performance animals found throughout the world, and many different species of these animals, from big cats to elephants to many marine life such as dolphins and whales. So I think it's really important to consider the difference between domestication and taming. Since a tamed animal does not have any genetic differences with its wild ancestors and its wild relatives, it's a lot to be said about the differences between a domesticated animal, which is actually an evolved and genetically modified and differentiated species from its ancestors. So I really urge you to consider, whenever you travel next, to consider the different recreational activities you choose to support, be aware of the conditions of the animals, and be aware of the types of animals that are being held captive in many different zoos and circuses and performance settings throughout the world. All right, so I just have a few closing questions that you can consider before our next class next week. So my first question is, are humans meant to interfere with the natural process of species evolution? So obviously it's a pretty loaded question, so I'm hoping to get a bit of a polarized answer. So think about it throughout the week and before the next class. The next one is, if not, how can eating domesticated animals be justified? So if you believe that humans shouldn't be interfering with the natural evolution of a species, how can you justify the consumption of domesticated animals? And my final question is, if you do agree that humans play a natural role in the evolution and domestication of animals, where can the line be drawn of which animals are ethical to domesticate and which ones are not? All right, well, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all next week, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thanks a lot. And that's the end.